All right, so we're doing something a little different. It is Thursday, so it is live stream day. Um, Usually, I make all of my Patreon videos or all of my videos on Patreon for this day. They're only there. I decided since it's public there, I would make it public here on YouTube and see how I feel about that. We're going to do a little bit of gauge swatching today, just the knitting part, and hopefully with not too many interruptions of Monsieur le Chat. So, anyway, if you want to read any of the text or get a detailed bit of information about what I'm going to be talking about while I am knitting, then what I'm going to need you to do is head over to Patreon, and I will get a piece of paper that has my link on it, I think, somewhere, and at the end of this video. So if you're impatient, fast forward to the end. If you're catching this live, then obviously you're gonna have to wait. I did not think about that ahead of time, so yeah, this is what happens when you think about stuff on the cuff. So first things first, let's see if I can get something to write on. And at the same time not make a huge mess, right? So for the time being, check out my sweet knitting basket I've got here. Write this link down for you. So, real quick, if you want to follow me, you can become a patron, or you can watch these videos here live on Thursdays on YouTube, or you can check out the posts on my Patreon. There's text and whatnot below the post on Patreon, so a lot of the stuff I talk about, I go ahead and write it out for you so you don't have to remember it, and you have it there for you to easily reference. And then if I have something in the live that I didn't think of to say in the text, I go back and edit it and add that in there too, to include links and pictures. So, go. He loves to be on camera, y'all, by the way. Like, he thinks he needs to be on camera. So, let's see if I can place that there. So first things first, this is my gauge swatch so far. I'm at row 14, and I need to get to 40 rows. And so, yeah, go away, you. He is such a nuisance. So I'm going to try and get as far as I can in this video, and we'll see what happens. So the whole purpose of gauge swatching is to really get a feel for the fabric that you're going to be working with. You know, it's great to, just dive into a project, and I know that feeling all too well. But the reality is, if it's got to fit, or you want to see the drape or anything like that, you're going to have to do a swatch. And a swatch doesn't have to be terribly big. A good size swatch is 4x4 or 6x6. Those are going to give you the most information. You can certainly do a smaller swatch, but the problem with the smaller swatch is ideally you should be able to measure in several different places, and the smaller the swatch, the harder that's going to be. And that's just because you want to get a real accurate estimation of how large the gauge is. And gauge, by the way, refers to a few different things. So if you're not a knitter or a crocheter, or you don't do any kind of fiber arts, that may not make any sense. That's okay. I invite you to stay along for the ride anyway. But one of the primary reasons that we gauge is to note the behavior of the fabric. The whole purpose of that is, hey, I'm going to put on all this effort to the sweater. Is it going to fit? Is it going to be the right size? Is it going to be a stiff fabric? Is it going to be soft after it's been worked? You know, what is it really going to look like? And as you can see, this has got a nice amount of stretch to it. It is not too heavy. It's a little stiff, but I still have to block it as well. And so there is that. And let's see what I'm looking at my notes as well. Now, the other big reason, and this is actually the first reason most people think about swatching, is you need to know the size of a finished object. Now, a lot of people like to say that gauge doesn't matter, and that is not in any way accurate. Somebody may not care about gauge. They may not be interested in the information that gauge can provide, or it may not matter to them, but in general, it does in fact matter. Because whether it's a garment or a toy, your gauge swatch is going to give you an idea of how large something will be. And if you're trying to meet the same size as a pattern or a designer has set out, then you need to know how close your gauge is. And if your gauge is too far off, then what ends up happening is you're going to have something that is too small or too large. And in the case of, you know, a hat or even a scarf, that is going to matter. If you don't like large scarves and your gauge is much bigger than what the pattern is calling for, then you're going to get a larger scarf. Now, the funny thing about this is this all comes down to really a lot of math, which anybody who knows me knows I don't like math because I struggle with it. And so imagine my surprise and shock when I realized how much math there was in art. Let me tell you, not happy. Somewhere one of my teachers is laughing, right? So if you want to meet the pattern size, you need to know the gauge. The other thing that gauge tells you in relation to size is that if you want to match the gauge and you don't want it to be bigger or smaller, then you know that you need to change your tool size. And that's usually what people do first. So if in making the swatch, these stitches it's too many stitches per inch, then that means I need to go up a needle size. If it is too few, then I need to go down. Now, that is a twofold issue, however. So the first part that most people get is, okay, you're going to have to change your tool size. But that is working under the assumption that you can meet gauge within two sizes, up or down. If you cannot, then you need to pick a different yarn. And then you need to start your swatching process all over. Because the reality of it is, and a lesser known fact, all yarns do not work for all projects. And so the reality of that is the yarn that you've chosen just might not work. And I have run into this before. It is not ideal. If you find yourself having to change the size of your tools again a third time, then that is your clue to stop. Because what will end up happening is you will have a finished object that the fabric of it is not going to be ideal. Either it's going to be too loose or it's going to be too stiff. And you know, you want the integrity of your project to be what it needs to be per what it is. So that's another bit of information. And just for anybody who drops in, see there's somebody here. I'm not going to address anyone because I am not actually looking at the camera. I'm looking at my hands around the camera. So If you want to ask me questions or make comments or anything like that, you can say those things either in the comments below the video, or you can head over to Patreon and comment there, and then I will see it and be able to address any comments, concerns, or questions that you have. But the trouble with working around the camera is I can't look through the camera to see what I'm doing. So that's what's going on there. And usually these videos are not public, so I'm not used to having to talk to someone directly. And I'll probably do them public for the rest of the year, which I understand is only like another week and a half. But we'll see how I feel about it. So another thing to consider is when you're swatching, making this little square or rectangle, whatever it happens to be, is only part of swatching. You also have to block it. And blocking is when you moisten an object and then stretch and pin it so that it can dry flat. And usually other things that you do when you are blocking is you're going to fix any kind of odd inconsistencies you may have in the shape and the edging of the finished item. Now, when it comes to three-dimensional objects like toys, you would not block that. However, if it's going to be washed, you should still definitely block your swatch, because when you're blocking, you want to see how the fabric is going to behave based on how it's treated. Now, generally when people are blocking, you are hand washing and you're going to treat the object exactly as you would. And most of the time when you hand knit or hand crochet, you're not trying to throw that in the wash machine. It's not a good idea. It is a recipe for disaster, and it can lead to you destroying something. Which is not to say that something that is handmade is not sturdy, so much as washers and dryers are really rough on objects. And in theory, you should not probably wash most of your clothes in a washer because of how rough the machine is and the agitator on the fabric. So, little tidbits from your neighborhood friendly fiber artist. But and toys and three-dimensional things and things where the size is of marginal importance to the person who is making it, those are the times when people like to say, oh, well, gauge doesn't matter. But they're usually neglecting the whole idea of blocking the swatch. So this will be hand washed. The sweater will be hand washed, because I'm not going to chance taking something that I've poured hours of my life into and putting it in the washer and it's stretching out, or some part like a sleeve wrapping around the agitator and then it pulling one sleeve and the other sleeve doesn't get pulled, because there is a limit to how far fibers will stretch before they won't stretch back. There's actually a word for it. I can't think of what it is off the top of my head, but if I recall, I will I'll put it in the Patreon in the comments under the video. But it has to do with the elasticity of not just the original fiber, right? There's a little bit of pull here, but also the elasticity of the finished fabric. So those are two different points of stretch that you have to consider. And so another tip is, as you can see, we got a little bit of curl here, right? This is stockinette stitch. That's what this is. It's all knitting. It's super boring, but if you want to see the yarn or see the color, this is a really good stitch to use. But over here, I've got this little funky little textured border, and this right here is seed stitch. Now, I know it doesn't look like it's flat right now, and that's because it's under tension and being worked, and like part of it's on a cable, part of it's on a needle, and I'm pulling at it. But once it's blocked and dried, this will lay perfectly flat. Stockinette has a tendency to want to curl on its own. And so whenever I swatch, one of the things that I do is I go ahead and use a seed or a garter stitch border. And that way I can actually have something lay flat, and it'll just be a lot easier for me to measure the swatch. Stockinette will curl like this, only it'll curl around the sides, and it'll curl quite a bit, and it'll curl around both sides. And even after blocking, it's hard to get the edges of stockinette to lie still. So there's that. And this is a new to me yarn. It is Cloudborn Highland Sport. I actually have a bunch in my stash. And I'll probably update the Patreon and link to my stash. Here, my stash and the needles that I'm using. But I have a bunch, and I had not used it yet. I actually bought 3 shawls worth of this yarn in I think 6 different colors. So there's that. But I have yet to use it yet. And so that is another reason that swatching is important. If you're not familiar with the behavior of a yarn, you should absolutely swatch. Yeah. I just caught that. This is a large thing caught my eye, but yeah. And now let me just be clear. I hate swatching. I hate it a lot. I don't want to do it. I'm very tempted after I swatch to take this apart and add it to the sweater, which is what this is for. But I'm not going to. I'm going to be responsible and just do this. But I feel like it's time wasted, but the reality is it really isn't. This is important information to ensure a pleasant finished object. And a lot of the people that I find don't like swatching, most of them have probably never made a sweater or never made something where they wanted it to be a specific size. Or making something that, you know, like even with the hat, you want to know that the hat fits the right size. However, a hat's also going to be a lot more forgiving and is going to stretch. So there's that. But, you know, other things, not so much. And the reality is when you stretch something, the more you stretch it, you're messing with the integrity of the fabric. And so while this will stretch, like I said, with the tension, eventually it's not going to this will stretch back here, right? And you got all those stitches all nice and even and lined up, and that's great. But after doing that for hours at a time, case in point, think of a hat or socks, it's just not going to stretch back. And if you've ever bought store-bought socks, particularly ones that are above crew length, which is about mid-thigh or mid-calf, but like towards your knee, especially, those socks, once they stretch, that's it. They don't stretch back. And, you know, then the fabric can't do what it needs to do, which is stay up on your leg. So, you know, if you don't make clothes or if you don't pay attention to your clothes, it's really easy to dismiss this information. But for those people who do, or you want to get into making clothes, whether you are sewing formally or you're knitting, crocheting, or weaving, or some other fiber art, you know, this does become really important. Because while clothes can certainly be pretty and wonderful accessories, they also need to do their job. And if they can't do their job, they're not much help. So there's that. And that weird clicking noise, I don't know if you can hear it. That is the cable hitting my tripod. So if that is irritating, I do apologize. I have my tripod precariously set up to ensure I could get as close to the camera as I could, but also have it as clear as I could. And so this is a new setup. It means it's weird and imperfect. But that's okay, right? This is live video. We're not trying to be perfect. We're just trying to get done. But yeah, I do really like this color. I'm really excited about it. I wasn't sure how it was going to look in person. It's a light gray. It's called Gray Heather, I do believe. And I think this is my first time using this weight of yarn as well. When you go into craft stores or even your local yarn shop, what is very popular to see is a lot of worsted. There'll be some bulky and super bulky in chain stores like Michael's or Joann or AC Moore. There'll be very, very, very little fingering yarn, which is also referred to as sock yarn. You'll have some sport. A lot of the sport I find is baby colored, and that's what it's used to. So baby hats, blankets, cardigans, socks, whatnot. And that's pretty much it. It's very hard to find lace weights or fingering, and even finding super jumbo, like the huge one, it's not always easy to find. A local yarn shop will be a little better about the range, but outside of the worsted, bulky, and super bulky weight, you just don't commonly see them. And that's because unless you're gonna knit lace all the time or knit socks or make super huge items, it's just not common, which is, you know, whatever, but not necessarily helpful when you're looking for a specific yarn. But I do like how this works up. And these are my, I think the way you say is like, it's Lykke. And like I said earlier, I will go ahead and put that in the Patreon post in the description below so that you can look up all this cool stuff. Just a note for anybody who's watching this on YouTube, I am not going to put any of the show notes in the live at all. If you want to see all that stuff, you're going to have to carry your behind over to Patreon. This is a public post though, so you don't have to be a patron to see it. Although I absolutely welcome you to be. And part of the whole point of me being on Patreon is, you know, while I do make things for sale, sometimes it's not your style. Sometimes it's not what you want. Sometimes you're a maker and you have no need to buy something from another maker, which is completely legitimate. But if you would like to support me as a creator, that's an easy, super fun way to do that. And I post fairly regularly. I've been focused on some other stuff lately, so I've not been posting as much or as per my schedule. Oh, okay. Come on back here. Is that right? Yeah, that's right. And I think I took an entire class on Craftsy about gauge. I'll see if I can find it. And I'll put that in the Patreon show notes. Yeah, when I started, I refused to swatch, and I was like most people who are new, like, I don't need to do that, or I don't want to do that. I don't see the purpose in that, and I have since learned my lesson, and I will absolutely get on a soapbox about it. Just because I'm very technical. If you have not noticed, I'm very detail oriented, and you know, if you don't care about the size, if you don't care about the drape, if you don't care about matching the size, and if you don't care about the fabric characteristics, oh, well, sure, it doesn't matter. But most people care at least about one of those things, and those aren't always clear to people who say, oh, I don't like swatching. And me personally, my preference, I want whatever I'm making to be the size that it is supposed to be. The other thing that I didn't mention, and I'll try to remember to put it in my Patreon in the show notes, is that doing a swatch will tell you how much yarn you need, which is super important information to know. So this is for a sweater. It's called the Severin cardigan, and if you head over to the show notes on Patreon, you will see. You can't look at the pattern page because it does not exist, but you can see the pattern sample page by the designer. So very clear about that. The designer is Vanessa Smith. And I first of all, I love all of her sweaters. Like, oh, the colors she chooses alone make those sweaters for me. But wait, train of thought in the tunnel. It happens. Oh, so I bought 15 skeins of yarn for this sweater, by the way, and I'm gonna be really upset if it's not enough. And so if I can't match gauge, then that means either I'm gonna have too little yarn or too much yarn. So that is another point. And as much as I love playing yarn chicken, I'm good. I'd rather not. It's not on the list of things I'd like to be doing. So just a little warning, about to end this video. I need to go eat, and then I have to pick up my little, and so I'll be skittering off here soon. I'm going to try my damnedest to remember all of these things that I wanted to put in there. So about the needles, and there's something else I wanted to link to. I'm now forgetting. Oh, the needles, the gauge class, and the bit about yarn estimation. And I will try to get all of that in there, but I don't want to promise. And if you see this video and you notice that I don't answer that question and I don't update the show notes, feel free to comment below the video on Patreon and be like, hey, you said you were going to do this. Why haven't you done this? And then I'll do this. So here we go. This is, I've gotten, I think, to row 26. I need to actually count because I think I forgot to mark the update on my counter while I was knitting once or twice. So this is about how far we've gotten. Because this is a swatch and it is only so wide, I was able to get super far, and I'm doing stockinette and seed stitch, so it's not at all something that I need to pay super tons of attention to. But I would say we're just under double. I was at 14 rows before I started recording, and now I'm at about 26. And I say about because, again, I'm not actually sure that I marked all the little things off. So I'm going to be going to 40. And that does include the border. One other thing about if you're going to add a seed or garter stitch border, make sure that you add those extra stitches and rows on. If you are, if you're supposed to get X amount of, 20 stitches per 4 inches, and then you take the border out of that, you're not going to have 20 stitches to measure, and you want 20 stitches to measure. And actually, you want more than that, to be honest with you. So you should always pad it. I be honest with you, I did not do that because I'm going to be measuring for 1 or 2 inches at a time with my gauge ruler versus a full 4, which is not advisable, which is why making a 6x6 swatch is a much better idea, because you can absolutely measure 4 full inches in the patterned stitch. But, I do cut corners here and there. Mostly I want to start knitting my sweater, and the longer I take to make this swatch, the less time I get to knit my sweater. So yeah, and I have a deadline. So there's that. So I'm going to try and remember all of those little tidbits that I threw in there. Thank you for watching. I don't know how to say your name, and I don't want to butcher it because I have my name butchered all the time and it makes me very angry. So thank you for watching. If you were on YouTube live with me, or you caught the live later, if you're on Patreon and you caught it the live while it was live or later, I appreciate you hanging out with me. I hope that you have a better appreciation for gauge and why you would want to do a swatch and why it matters. And whether you decide to swatch in the future, you will at least appreciate why it's done. So I'm off to Nosh, and I hope that you have a wonderful Thursday. And I should be back on Patreon tomorrow. Tomorrow is our Sabbath cast, because I think it's actually a lunar cast as well. So there will be no finished object this week. I think you should be able to look for that next week. So yeah, next week. next Friday. But enjoy. And if I don't see you again or you don't hear from me again, because I'm going to be touch and go through the end of the year trying to finish some stuff up, have a wonderful new year. A happy whatever holiday you celebrate. And if you celebrate Hanukkah, happy Hanukkah. Missed it. And toodles. Bye.